For most people, Windows 11 looks fine. It boots, it updates, and on the surface, everything seems normal until basic things start breaking. And while Microsoft keeps telling users that Windows 11 is secure, stable, and improving, former employees are quietly telling a very different story. They're warning people to abandon Windows 11, not because of a single bug, but because of what they saw internally and what those changes mean long-term. A system that won't shut down properly. An update that changes how your computer behaves overnight. Problems that aren't announced, explained, or optional. These aren't issues you can wait out. They're structural decisions. And once you're locked in, there's no real way back. If you rely on Windows for work, school, or anything you can't afford to lose, this video breaks down why this matters, and why the problems you're seeing now may only be the beginning. This isn't the Microsoft people remember. For a long time, Microsoft was known for being cautious, sometimes frustratingly so. Windows updates moved slowly. Features took years to roll out, and major changes were debated endlessly before they ever reached users. But that caution existed for a reason. When you're responsible for the operating system running hospitals, schools, offices, and entire governments, breaking things isn't an option. That older version of Microsoft treated Windows like critical infrastructure. Stability came first, new features were secondary, and anything that could interfere with basic functionality shutting down, logging in, recovering a system when something went wrong, was considered unacceptable to ship in a broken state. Former employees describe a very different environment today. Inside Microsoft, Windows 11 is no longer treated as a finished product that must be protected at all costs. It's treated as a continuously evolving service, something that can be updated, adjusted, and corrected later. On paper, that sounds modern, agile, efficient, but in practice, it changes how risk is calculated. When an operating system is viewed as something that can always be fixed later, the bar for what's considered good enough quietly drops. Bugs that once would have blocked a release are now weighed against timelines. Core features that misbehave aren't always treated as emergencies if telemetry suggests they don't affect everyone. The question shifts from, does this work, to, does this work for most people, most of the time? And that distinction matters. Because from the user's perspective, Windows doesn't feel like a service. It feels like a tool you depend on. When it fails, it doesn't fail politely. It fails during work, during deadlines, during moments when "we'll fix it later" isn't an acceptable answer. Former employees point to this cultural shift as the root of many Windows 11 problems, not a lack of talent, not incompetence, but a change in priorities, speed over certainty, data over lived experience, metrics over trust. From the outside, this shows up as randomness. One update works fine, the next one breaks something basic. One user has no issues. Another suddenly can't shut down their system properly or access a remote machine they rely on. There's rarely a clear explanation, and rollback options are increasingly limited. From the inside, this isn't random at all. It's the predictable result of building an operating system around processes instead of people. Understanding this shift is important because it reframes what's happening on your computer. These issues aren't isolated mistakes. They're symptoms of how Windows 11 is now being developed and maintained. And once you see that, it becomes easier to understand why some former Microsoft employees no longer trust Windows the way they once did. Which leads to the next question. If this is how updates are being approved now, how exactly are these changes making it all the way to your machine? How Windows 11 started breaking the basics. One of the most unsettling things about Windows 11 isn't the bugs themselves, it's which things are breaking. In the past, when Windows updates caused problems, they usually lived at the edges. A driver issue, a niche feature, something annoying, but survivable. You might grumble, search a forum, wait for a fix, and move on. The foundation stayed solid. With Windows 11, that line has shifted. Former employees and longtime IT professionals point out that the failures users are seeing now aren't exotic edge cases, they're basic functions. Shutting down a system, connecting remotely, recovering a machine when something goes wrong. These are the core promises of an operating system. When they stop behaving predictably, the entire platform feels unstable, even if everything looks fine. And that's where the confusion starts for most users. because nothing announces itself as broken. Windows still boots, apps still open, updates still install, the interface looks modern and polished. But then something subtle happens. The shutdown button doesn't behave the way it always has. A remote connection that worked yesterday suddenly fails. A recovery option exists on paper, but doesn't actually help when you need it. Each issue on its own feels small, easy to dismiss. But taken together, they paint a very different picture. Former insiders explain that when development prioritizes speed and iteration, fundamentals can quietly lose their protected status. Features that used to be untouchable become just another component in a massive system one that can be patched later if enough people complain. The problem is, users experience those failures in real time. A system that won't shut down properly isn't just inconvenient. It can mean lost work, corrupted files, or machines that refuse to reset cleanly. Remote access issues don't just affect hobbyists. They affect people who manage servers, work from home, or support others. A broken recovery environment doesn't show up until everything else has already gone wrong. And by then, it's too late. What makes this especially frustrating is the lack of clarity. These problems often arrive without warning. They aren't explained in plain language. They aren't optional. An update installs, behavior changes, and users are left trying to figure out whether the issue is their fault or something deeper. This is where many former Microsoft employees say alarm bells started going off. Not because bugs exist, bugs always exist, but because the types of bugs slipping through signal a shift in what's being protected during development. When the basics aren't treated as sacred, everything built on top of them becomes less reliable. Once you recognize that pattern, another uncomfortable question comes up. If these issues are making it into public releases, how exactly are updates being tested before they reach you? The testing illusion, why you're the guinea pig, now, Microsoft still, talks about testing as if it works the way it always has. Insider programs, preview builds, feedback hubs. From the outside, it sounds like Windows updates go through a long, careful vetting process before they ever reach regular users. That's the theory. Former employees describe something more subtle and more concerning. Testing hasn't disappeared, but its role has changed. Instead of acting as a hard stop that prevents risky updates from shipping, it now functions more like an early warning system. Problems are logged, measured, and tracked, but they don't necessarily block a release unless they reach a certain threshold. In other words, updates aren't held back until they're safe. They're pushed forward unless they're proven dangerous. That distinction changes everything. In earlier versions of Windows, testing was designed to protect users from instability. Today, it's increasingly designed to measure how much instability users will tolerate. Telemetry doesn't just report failures. It determines which failures matter. If an issue doesn't immediately impact a large enough percentage of machines, it may never be treated as urgent, even if it breaks something essential for the people affected. This is where many users start to feel like they're losing their footing. An update installs automatically. Nothing looks wrong at first. Then, something behaves differently. A setting moves. A function no longer responds the same way. A workflow that's been stable for years suddenly feels unreliable. When users search for answers, they often find scattered reports, vague acknowledgments, or silence. From Microsoft's perspective, this data-driven approach is efficient. Rolling out updates broadly generates real-world information that no lab environment can fully replicate. Every hardware configuration, every use case, every edge condition appears instantly. That scale is powerful, but it comes with a cost, and users pay it. Because in this model, real people become part of the validation process. Their downtime becomes a data point. Their frustration becomes feedback. Their lost productivity becomes an acceptable trade-off as long as the system improves over time. Former insiders say this is why so many Windows 11 issues feel unresolved rather than broken and fixed. Updates don't always aim to restore things to the way they were. They aim to stabilize the new normal. If a change causes enough disruption to trigger metrics, it gets adjusted. If it doesn't, users are expected to adapt. That's also why official responses often feel unsatisfying. You're told to restart, to wait for the next patch, to submit feedback. Rarely are you told why the issue happened or whether the behavior you're seeing is considered a bug or an intentional change. That uncertainty erodes trust far more than a straightforward failure ever could. And then there's the question of choice. With Windows 11, updates aren't just encouraged, they're enforced. Deferring them gets harder. Rolling them back gets riskier. Staying on a known, stable version becomes nearly impossible over time. Once your system is part of the update pipeline, stepping out of it requires effort, technical knowledge, and sometimes luck. This is why some former Microsoft employees describe the current model as quietly coercive, not because it's malicious, but because it removes meaningful consent. You don't opt in to being part of large-scale testing. You inherit it. Understanding this helps reframe what you're experiencing. When something breaks after an update, it isn't always because someone made a mistake. It's often because the system accepted that risk and decided the fallout was tolerable. And if that's how updates are validated now, the question isn't whether more issues will appear. It's how much control you still have when they do. Losing control of your own computer. For many people, the moment Windows started to feel different wasn't when something broke. It was when something changed, and there was no way to stop it. Windows 11 doesn't ask the way older versions did. Updates aren't suggestions, and they aren't conversations. They arrive on a schedule you don't control, install when the system decides it's convenient, and often alter behavior without clear warning. You wake up, sign in, and discover your computer doesn't work quite the way it did yesterday. That loss of control is subtle at first. Maybe it's a restart you didn't approve, a setting that moved or reset, a feature that behaves differently after an update you didn't have time to read about. On their own, these things seem minor, but together, they signal a deeper shift. Windows no longer treats the person using the machine as the final authority over it. Former employees explain that this wasn't an accident. As Windows evolved into a constantly updating service, control became something that had to be centralized, allowing millions of users to delay, block, or customize updates made the ecosystem harder to manage. From Microsoft's perspective, consistency meant reliability. Fewer versions, fewer variables, fewer unknowns. From the user's perspective, it meant something else entirely. It meant that saying, "not right now," stopped being an option. It meant that rolling back a bad update became harder, riskier, or temporary. It meant that stability became something you hoped for, not something you could enforce. This hits hardest for people who rely on their computers to function predictably. Remote workers, students, IT administrators, small business owners, anyone whose day can't pause while an update finishes or a new issue reveals itself. When Windows decides to change how something works, the burden of adaptation lands on the user, not the system. And what makes this especially frustrating is the lack of transparency. Updates often arrive with vague descriptions. Security improvements, performance enhancements. Rarely do they explain what's being altered in a way that helps users make informed decisions. You're told it's important, you're told it's necessary, you're rarely told what it might disrupt. Over time, this creates a strange relationship with the operating system. You stop trusting it to stay the same. You start bracing for changes instead of expecting stability. You hesitate before updates, not because you're reckless, but because experience has taught you that improvement can come with unexpected costs. Former Microsoft employees describe this as one of the most profound changes in how Windows is built. Not the interface, not the branding, but the assumption that control should flow one way, from the platform to the user. Once that assumption takes hold, it's hard to reverse. And that leads directly to the next contradiction at the heart of Windows 11. Updates are justified in the name of security, yet the instability they introduce can create risks of their own. Security versus stability, the trade nobody agreed to. Every time Windows 11 changes something you didn't ask for, the justification is almost always the same: security. Microsoft presents updates as protection, something done in your best interest, whether you like it or not. The implication is clear: if you hesitate, delay, or question an update, you're putting yourself at risk. In that framing, inconvenience becomes a necessary sacrifice, and instability is treated as an acceptable side effect. But that logic only works if updates actually make systems safer in practice. Former Microsoft employees argue that somewhere along the way, security became something measured more by speed than by outcome. How fast a vulnerability is patched, how quickly an update ships, how aggressively systems are kept in sync. Those are easy things to track. They look good in reports. They signal action. What's harder to measure is the real-world cost of disruption. Because security doesn't just mean closing theoretical holes. It means keeping systems usable, predictable, and recoverable when something goes wrong. A computer that can't shut down properly, fails to connect remotely, or behaves unpredictably after an update isn't safer. It's harder to manage and easier to break further. Stability is what allows security to function. When a system behaves consistently, administrators can monitor it. Users can recognize abnormal behavior. Backups run reliably. Recovery tools work when needed. But when updates introduce unexpected changes, even well-intentioned security improvements can undermine the very safety they're meant to provide. This is where the trade becomes uncomfortable. Users are increasingly asked to accept instability in exchange for protection they can't see. A forced update installs overnight. The system technically becomes more secure, but something critical no longer works as expected. Maybe it's a driver, maybe it's networking, maybe it's power management. The vulnerability is closed, but the machine is now less dependable, and when that happens, the burden doesn't fall on Microsoft. It falls on the user. Former insiders say this shift has reframed what acceptable risk means inside the company. If a security update breaks something for a small percentage of users, that's often considered tolerable. If the vulnerability is addressed quickly, the mission is seen as accomplished, even if the system is left in a worse state for some people. From a corporate perspective, that's efficient. From a user perspective, it's unsettling, because it forces a false choice: update and risk disruption, or resist and risk exposure. There's no real middle ground. No meaningful ability to say, I need this system to remain stable right now. No acknowledgement that reliability itself is a form of protection. This is why many experienced users have become cautious, not careless. They don't delay updates because they don't care about security. They delay them because they understand that a broken system can be just as dangerous as an unpatched one, especially when it holds work, personal data, or access to other systems. Former Microsoft employees describe this as one of the clearest warning signs in Windows 11's evolution. Not that updates exist, but that stability has stopped being treated as inseparable from security. When those two concepts drift apart, users are left absorbing risk they never agreed to carry. If this is the environment Windows 11 now operates in, why are so many insiders choosing not to depend on it themselves? Why insiders are quietly moving on? What makes this situation uncomfortable for Microsoft isn't public outrage or viral headlines. It's what's happening quietly, behind the scenes. Former Microsoft employees rarely go on record telling people to abandon Windows 11. There are obvious reasons for that. Professional relationships, legal constraints, and the simple reality that criticizing a former employer publicly can close doors. But what they do share, privately and informally, shows up very clearly in how they choose to use technology themselves. And that behavior tells a story. Many insiders don't rely on Windows the way they once did. Not for personal machines, not for sensitive work, not for anything they can't afford to have interrupted. Windows hasn't disappeared from their lives, but its role has changed. It's no longer the default foundation. It's something they compartmentalize. That shift matters, because these aren't casual users reacting emotionally to a bad update. These are people who understand how Windows is built, how updates are approved, and how failures are triaged once they reach the public. They know which issues are likely to be fixed quickly, and which ones can linger quietly for months. When that knowledge leads to more cautious behavior, it's not fear, it's informed risk management. What's especially revealing is how undramatic this transition is. There's no mass exodus announcement, no coordinated rejection, no loud campaign against Windows 11. Instead, there's a quiet recalibration. Important data lives elsewhere. Critical workflows move off Windows when possible. Backups become more aggressive. Windows becomes something you use, not something you trust. Former insiders describe this as a natural response to uncertainty. When you stop believing a system will remain predictable, you stop giving it responsibility. You don't panic. You reduce exposure. And that's the part most users miss. Public messaging still frames Windows 11 as stable, secure, and improving. But privately, behavior suggests a more cautious assessment. Functional, but volatile. Capable, but increasingly unpredictable. Good enough for some tasks, but not reliable enough to be central. That gap between messaging and behavior is where trust erodes fastest. Because trust isn't about whether something works today, it's about confidence that it will behave the same way tomorrow. When the people closest to the system start planning around potential disruption instead of assuming continuity, that's a signal worth paying attention to. This is why watching what insiders do matters more than what anyone says publicly. They aren't predicting collapse. They aren't claiming Windows 11 is unusable. They're acknowledging that the relationship has changed, that stability and control can no longer be taken for granted. And once that assumption is gone, every decision becomes more cautious. For regular users, this doesn't mean copying insiders blindly. It means understanding the logic behind their choices. If the people who know the most are quietly minimizing their dependence on Windows 11, it's worth asking why, and whether your own setup assumes a level of reliability that may no longer exist. Which brings the warning into focus. Abandon Windows 11 isn't a call to panic. It's a call to reassess, to stop treating the operating system as something that will always act in your best interest by default, and to start thinking about how much of your work, data, and daily life you're willing to tie to a system that even its builders now approach with caution. That understanding sets up the final step. What this warning actually asks you to do next. What abandon Windows 11 actually means. When people hear the word abandon, it sounds extreme, like ripping everything out overnight, like panic, like burning bridges. That's not what this warning is really saying. Abandon Windows 11 doesn't mean uninstalling today or throwing away your computer. It means abandoning the assumption that Windows will always act in your best interest by default. It means recognizing that the relationship has changed, and continuing to behave as if it hasn't is where the real risk lives. Windows used to be something you could trust to stay out of your way. Updates were cautious. Changes were slow. When something broke, you could usually trace it, roll it back, or avoid it next time. With Windows 11, that contract looks different. Updates are mandatory, changes are centralized, rollbacks are shrinking, and users are expected to absorb the fallout quietly. So, preparation matters. Preparation means backing up like you actually might need those backups. It means separating critical work from convenience. It means not tying everything you care about to a system you don't control. For some people, that might mean exploring alternatives. For others, it simply means treating Windows as a tool, not a foundation you blindly trust with everything important. Either approach is valid. What's dangerous is pretending nothing has changed. The real issue with Windows 11 isn't that it fails sometimes. Software always fails. The issue is that when it fails now, users have less say, less warning, and fewer ways out than they used to. Control has shifted, and when control shifts, responsibility shifts too. That's why this warning matters. Former Microsoft employees didn't arrive at this conclusion because they hate Windows. They arrived at it because they understand how decisions are being made now, and what those decisions prioritize. When people who know the system best start limiting their dependence on it, that's not drama, that's signal. So the real question isn't whether Windows 11 works today, it's whether you're comfortable building your work, your data, and your daily life on a system that may not behave the same way tomorrow. If you've noticed Windows becoming less predictable, harder to control, or more disruptive than it used to be, you're not imagining it. Share your experience in the comments, especially if Windows updates have affected your work or school. Those stories matter more than release notes ever will. And if you want more breakdowns like this, less hype, more context, subscribe. Because Windows 11 isn't the last time users are going to be asked to trade control for convenience. And this conversation isn't ending anytime soon. The warning isn't about abandoning Windows overnight. It's about abandoning blind trust before the next update makes that decision for you. That's why preparation matters. Preparation means backing up like you might actually need those backups. It means separating critical work from convenience. It means not tying everything you care about to a system you don't fully control. For some people, that might mean exploring alternatives. For others, it simply means treating Windows as a tool, not a foundation you blindly trust with everything important. The real issue with Windows 11 isn't that it fails sometimes. Software always fails. The issue is that when it fails now, users have less say, less warning, and fewer ways out than they used to. Control has shifted, and when control shifts, responsibility shifts too. Former Microsoft employees didn't arrive at this warning because they hate Windows. They arrived at it because they understand how decisions are being made now and what those decisions prioritize. When people who know the system best start limiting their dependence on it, that's not drama. That's signal. So the real question isn't whether Windows 11 works today. It's whether you're comfortable building your work, your data, and your daily life on a system that may not behave the same way tomorrow. If you've noticed Windows becoming less predictable, harder to control, or more disruptive than it used to be, you're not imagining it. Share your experience in the comments, especially if Windows updates have affected your work or school. And if you want more breakdowns like this, subscribe, because this conversation isn't ending anytime soon. The warning isn't about abandoning Windows overnight. It's about abandoning blind trust before the next update makes that decision for you.